Hey everyone, welcome to Crime Family. In today's cases, I'm going to talk about something that is rare, I guess. Often when people think about it, they find it super creepy. I'm talking about sleepwalking. There's just something really eerie about a person being fully unconscious, but being able to walk around and do potentially dangerous things to themselves and others. Today, I'm going to be talking about the sleepwalking stories of Scott Falater and Kenneth Parks. Thanks for joining us.
So before we get started on this week's episode, I wanted to tell you guys about a great podcast called Destination Mystery. It's hosted by Melissa and Mike, and each episode they talk about a paranormal event or a true crime investigation, and they not only tell you about the case itself, and some of which are in some very remote places in the US, but they also travel to that location in the episode and investigate it for themselves. So each episode brings new content that won't be found anywhere else. So it's very exciting. Very good podcast, so we hope you check it out.
I'm Melissa.
I'm Mike, and we are Destination Mystery.
Coming to you from Mystery Media Group, Destination Mystery paints the story for paranormal content, abnormal adventures, and the fun behind the investigations.
Each week, we will take you to a new destination where we solve the mystery. This is not the same old ghost story you've heard before. We will not only tell the spooky story, we'll go to a remote location to investigate it for ourselves.
So fasten your seatbelt and put on your helmet as we take you to a new adventure that will leave you questioning what you've always thought about the paranormal.
Okay, so before I get started, do you guys know anything about this case, or like what do you guys know about sleepwalking in general? Just kind of get like a sense of where you guys are at with this.
Oh no, I think sleepwalking is super like fascinating, and like honestly, like sleep disorders in general are just kind of weird. Or sleep human body is just weird. But yeah, like when you told me that you were going to be doing like an episode or cases about sleepwalking crimes and stuff like that, I was very intrigued. So I'm excited to hear the details of these specific cases.
Yeah, I'm with AJ. Like when you told me we were going to do sleepwalking, I was super excited because I just find sleepwalking cases really interesting. I don't know this case, but I've seen other cases or watched a documentary on sleepwalking one time, and I found it really, really fascinating. It's kind of crazy how people can just do things when they're not awake, and it's kind of, I don't know, I just find it really bizarre, but also very interesting. So I'm very excited to hear what you have to say about this case.
Yeah, so I find it super fascinating too, and I tried not to go down like a rabbit hole. Like I started looking at like academic papers about like sleepwalking and like sleep disorders, and I really tried not to go down like a rabbit hole, so I'm just gonna scratch the surface with this. Okay, so I was reading some papers, and there's a paper written by Pavlova and Luttrell. It was published in 2019, and it's just called Sleep Disorders, and it was published in the American Journal of Medicine. And they say that there's 6 major sleep disorders, or there's 6 major ones that they talk about in this paper. Anyway, they categorize them as insomnia, which is where you usually can't get to sleep properly. There's circadian rhythm disorders, sleep disordered breathing, hypersomnia or narcolepsy, which is like narcolepsy is where you just like fall asleep randomly and like anywhere at any time. There's parasomnias, which is where sleepwalking fits in. And then there's restless leg syndrome or periodic limb movement disorder. So that's interesting that there's all these different kind of categories. And they also say that sleep is like the universal function of all living species. So all living species have some sort of sleep. And sleep comprises about like 1/3 of human life. So for 1/3 of your whole life, you're asleep. And so like I said, parasomnia is like the broader term that encompasses sleepwalking. And these behaviors occur when parts of the brain are awake when they should be asleep. And they cause things like sleepwalking, sleep eating, and even sleep driving. There's another paper that I read by Popat and Winslad in 2005, and it's called While You Were Sleeping, Science and Neurobiology of Sleep Disorders and the Enigma of Legal Responsibility of Violence During Parasomnia. And they kind of, in this article, they compare parasomnia to being in a vegetative state. So like if someone has brain damage and they're like what we refer to as a vegetable, even though they're like in a vegetative state, they still go through like typical sleep and wake cycles, but they're unconscious and unresponsive to like any outside stimuli. In this sense, they're often referred to as awake, but not aware. But individuals that are in like a parasomnia episode, they're neither awake nor aware, and they're not awake and they're not asleep, so they're kind of like in this in-between limbo kind of thing. And since a person that's in a vegetative state is unconscious, they kind of consider individuals that are in a parasomnia episode to even be less conscious than a person that's in a vegetative state. So that's kind of crazy to think about. So, like in more simple terms, I guess what happens with sleepwalkers is that their brain is unable to like transition from a deep sleep into the dreaming stage, where most of us are able to do that while we're asleep. And there's like no issues when that happens, obviously. They go into this kind of like dissociated state that is in between awake and being asleep. And part of the brain functions as being awake and the other part is still being asleep. So you can kind of picture it as like someone that's kind of acting out their dreams in a way. So some experts say that a sleepwalker is actually like really strong, or they can be really strong if they are to like confront you, and they often don't recognize other people, right? Because they're kind of like in this zombie state. So they could see someone they know but not have any idea who they are. And a lot of experts say that it's really dangerous to interrupt somebody that's sleepwalking, because that's when they kind of get this fight or flight tendency and they can attack really viciously. So there's a doctor that was involved in both of these cases that I'm going to talk about. Her name was Dr. Rosen Cartwright. She actually died in January of 2021, but she was a sleep expert who specialized in sleep disorders. She described this on an episode of Forensic Files. It was season 9, episode 30, called Walking Terror. And she was saying that some of her former sleepwalking patients, she said, one had jumped out of a window. There was one that had thrust their arm really hard up against a plate glass door. One had kicked in a garage door. Another one had attacked the living room furniture with a butcher knife. And she said that some of her patients had even attacked other people. And they said they usually attack the closest person to them when these kind of attacks happen. So that's kind of a background of sleepwalking. Super just scratch the surface, but I thought it was kind of important so you understand kind of going into these cases.
So do you find anything about if this only happens in humans? Like, do animals, do other species also sleepwalk and as intensely sometimes? I'd be interested to know, if a dog sleepwalks and can attack you or something.
I don't know. I didn't see really go into other types of animals. There are obviously experts that study rat dreams and stuff like that. I don't know. I remember, I don't know if it was one of our dogs, but they used to kind of whimper in their sleep or something, or move
or
around
move their feet
like they're running or something. Yeah. So
yeah.
I think they probably, I don't know if they would actually be in a dream state, like a sleepwalking state, but they definitely, obviously they dream, but yeah.
I'm very interested. I'm gonna have to look up sleepwalking now. Like what you just described to me is really fascinating. I had no idea about sleepwalking and what it can do.
Yeah, it's creepy that sleepwalking is just one of the things that can happen. Like I said, people have the disorders where they sleep eat, where they just go into the fridge and just mow down. But anyway, yeah, so the first case I'm talking about is Scott Falater. And Scott was born in Chicago, and he met his wife Yarmila in high school. And she remembers that he used to fall asleep all the time in class. Scott had never dated anyone before Yarmila, and they started dating and they ended up getting married. Scott grew up in a really Catholic household, but he converted to LDS, or the Church of Latter-day Saints, as an adult, and Yarmila did the same. So they lived this Mormon lifestyle as adults, and they raised their kids as Mormon. So Scott was a engineer, and he worked for Motorola. And I don't know if you remember, but Motorola like manufactured some of the really early flip phones. It's like those big, like chunky flip phones that everybody used to have. And so that was his job. And him and Yarmila were married for 20 years. They had 2 kids, Michael, who was 12 at the time, and Megan, who was 15. The whole family had moved to Phoenix for Scott's job at Motorola, I believe, and at this time, Yarmila had given up her career to stay home and be a stay-at-home mom. They lived in a pretty safe, middle-class residential neighborhood where police activity was really something that didn't happen often. And like I said, the Falater family was really much involved in the LDS church. So a typical day for Scott would be that he would get up pretty early to teach his morning seminary or religious education class at 6:15 a.m. Then he would drive the kids to school, then he would go to work, and he'd be home from work around dinner every day. So that's like almost a full 12-hour day by the time he gets home for dinner. And some days, and on this particular day that I'm going to talk about, which is January 16th, 1997, after dinner, Scott would prepare for his next day's morning church class. So he had a really full day most days. So around 9 o'clock, it's already been like a pretty full day. Yarmila asks Scott to go out and try and fix their pool filter so that their pool wouldn't start to grow algae and turn green. So Scott goes out to fix the filter, and he realizes that, like, I guess like the O-ring is really corroded or stuck to the pool pump. And he has a knife and he's trying to like dig it out, but it's not working. So he just leaves it for the night and he goes back in the house. And some sources say that Yarmila had fallen asleep on the couch watching ER. And Scott just kisses her goodnight, and then he goes to bed, and he's exhausted around 10 o'clock p.m. that night. Next to the Falater house lives Greg and Stephanie Reedhead, and around 10 to 10:30 that night, they hear some kind of disturbance next door, and it's not something that they can just kind of shrug off and get over. It's enough for them to get up and see what's going on. Stephanie describes it as kind of like a moaning or screaming of some sort outside. Greg looks over the wall that separates the 2 properties, and he sees Yarmila just lying there on the pool deck. And at first he just kind of thinks that maybe she's like drunk or passed out or something. Not too long after, Greg sees Scott come out of the house, and he grabs Yarmila by the arms and drags her over to the pool, and he just kind of rolls her into the pool. And at first, like, the neighbor that's watching is thinking, oh, maybe he's just trying to like wake her up by like dunking her in the pool. But then he runs into the house and he's like, oh my god, he's holding her head underwater. So he calls the police right away. The police get to Greg's house and they go over to Scott's house, and they immediately see the pool water is light pink and Yarmila's body is floating in the pool. But there's no sign of Scott at this point. The officer goes to get Yarmila out of the pool, and that's when he sees the water start to turn dark red. And immediately he knows that it's not just a drowning. Something else has happened here. They can see Scott while they're outside, either through the glass door or in one of the windows in the house. And he has on like a fresh white t-shirt and pajama pants. When they go in the house, he acts really confused. He doesn't know why they're in there. Michael and Megan are still upstairs in their bed, and they don't wake up until the officer goes up there and tells them that their parents had gotten in a fight, and during this fight, their mother had died. And Michael, the son, thought that this was super weird right away because he said that he'd never seen his parents fight ever. And so this was something that just was out of the ordinary for them. When the police asked Scott how many people were in the house, he said that there was 4. So he was meaning that him and his wife were in the house along with his 2 kids. Scott is immediately arrested. And I mean, at this point, he figures a little bit out, but all he knows is that his wife is hurt outside by the pool, and he's still saying that he doesn't know what's going on. During the interrogation back at the police station, Scott never actually says that he didn't do it. All he says is, I just don't remember doing it. The police tell him that the neighbor said that he saw Scott hold Yarmila's head underwater, and he still doesn't believe that he did it. Like, he doesn't know why the neighbor would make that up. He says all he remembers is going to bed, and the next thing he knows is that the cops have him on the floor of his house. So he doesn't have any blood on his clothes at all. He has on that white t-shirt and his pajama pants. But then the police notice that he does have some of Yarmila's blood on his neck. And he also has like a fresh band-aid on his hand from a fresh cut that he doesn't remember putting on either, apparently. So of course the cops feel like this is an open and shut case. Like, they have an eyewitness that saw him drown Yarmila. And he's charged with first-degree murder, and if he's convicted, he could be given the death penalty. So Scott's defense is that he was sleepwalking, and his lawyers are saying that in order to be guilty, like, you have to be aware and conscious of what you're doing. And because he was asleep, he didn't know what he was doing, he wasn't aware that even if he did kill his wife, then he wasn't guilty. And this whole sleepwalking defense doesn't come up really until Scott's sister remembers that Scott used to sleepwalk when he was growing up. Scott's sister Laura remembers that Scott did used to sleepwalk, and Scott's mother Lois also backs up this story. They both remember him sleepwalking, and Lois remembers one time that Scott had gotten up in the middle of the night. He was like fully dressed for school, but he was asleep. He was just kind of standing there, but he went back to bed. And there was another time when he was older, like around 15, he woke up and he just came out of his room and went into the living room or something where everybody was. He was just like completely naked, just standing there. And then he kind of went back to bed. He doesn't remember any of this. There's also another time when Scott was around 20, and this was when he was like about to get married, and he was still in college getting ready for finals, and he was really stressed out. He went to bed early one night and came out of his room, and he was heading towards the back door. His sister was trying to talk to him, but he just like was in a daze and kept going. She realized that he was sleepwalking, and she ran to the front door to lock it so that he couldn't get out. But as she ran past him, she like rubbed against his shoulder. And so this kind of interrupted Scott, and he grabs her by the shoulder and just kind of like tossed her across the room. And he's still fully asleep. And Laura says like the look on his face was so angry, and he just looked demonic. So that's, like I was saying before, it's really dangerous if you try to wake or disturb a sleepwalker, because they can get really like aggressive and defensive. So that's kind of what happened in this case with Scott. But that's really the only reporting that I was able to find of like really serious incidents. And so I guess I just don't take it that seriously. It was like a one-off, and it never happened again. May 24th, 1999, this is when Scott's trial begins. The medical examiner testifies that Yarmila has 44 stab wounds, and they believe Scott put his left arm around her mouth so she couldn't scream, and then he stabbed her with his right hand. The lead prosecutor in the case is Juan Martinez, who, fun fact, was also the prosecutor in the Jodi Arias case. The prosecutor tries to describe Scott as being fully awake, like right after he stabs Yarmila, because Greg, the neighbor, describes seeing Scott in his house, and he sees lights going on in the bathroom, and then the light goes off in the bathroom, and then you can see him walk into the kitchen. And the neighbor, Greg, says it looks like Scott is kind of like washing his hands over the kitchen sink, and then looks like he puts on a pair of gloves, and then goes back out to Yarmila's body and pushes her in the water, and then leans over the side of the pool to push her head under. And some sources also state that Scott grabbed a flashlight on his way outside the first time to supposedly fix that pool pump, which isn't consistent with sleepwalking, as some experts say, because like when you're sleepwalking, you can't tell if it's night or day. So getting a flashlight to look around at night isn't something that you would do if you were sleepwalking. And so they're saying that doesn't match up with his story. Also, on that Forensic Files episode, it points out that Scott was aware that his dogs were barking, and he was trying to calm them down, which is also, they say, inconsistent with sleepwalking, because if the dogs were barking, he wouldn't be able to really hear them in his sleep, or it would have woken him up. But some experts say that the dogs were jumping on him and not really barking, and so his response was just kind of to get the dogs to settle down while he was asleep and not really them barking. So, I mean, there's some discrepancy there. The defense also points out that there really is no motive at all for the murder. Like, they were high school sweethearts, and they were apparently still really happy after 20 years. And at the time of this killing, Scott, again, was under a lot of stress. Like, remember how I said before, that's kind of what triggered it. He was about to get married. He was in the middle of his finals. So again, he was under a lot of stress at work, and he was teaching that religion class, which added a lot to his lack of sleep and workload. And he was just under a lot of pressure, and he was stressed. So this is believed to have been one of the triggers. He was sleep deprived and stressed. And then on top of that, they believe that Yarmila had tried to wake him up in his sleep, and that's what triggered that violent reaction. So also to help strengthen his case, Scott undergoes a medical examination where they try and track his brain activity while he's asleep. So they hook him up to all these machines, and they also have video cameras to watch him while he's sleeping. And they do this for 4 nights. This is while he's already in jail. but they bring him out to do this test. And for 4 nights, they watch him and they have him all hooked up. And the defense does say that the results show that he does have a propensity for sleepwalking, but then the state experts say that the results really don't show anything. So that really doesn't work out in favor of anybody, I guess. The defense brings in 2 experts on sleepwalking, Dr. Roger Broughton and, I'd mentioned her before, Dr. Rosalind Cartwright, and they both testified that it was their professional opinion that Scott was sleepwalking during this time. What the defense speculates happened is that Scott was sleep deprived and stressed out. He fell asleep, and then he rises in a sleepwalking state, and in that state he tries to go and fix that pool pump, because that's in his head something that he didn't get done, and he kind of just wants to get it done. Yarmila notices that he was gone, or he wakes her up somehow, and she gets up to bring him back into the house, bring him back to bed. And because she interrupts him, this is when, like I said before, the experts say the danger kicks in. And because he's asleep, he doesn't recognize her, and so that he sees her as a threat, that fight or flight thing or situation happens, and he has that knife from the pool pump trying to get that O-ring off, so he stabs her over 40 times. Another thing that doesn't really look good for Scott here, though, is that while the officers are searching the house, they're searching the garage, they search the house, they search the cars, and they eventually see a t-shirt that's sticking out from some sort of compartment in one of the cars. They open up that compartment and they find a black plastic garbage bag, and inside they find a large plastic container, and inside that they find bloody clothes and they find a blood-stained hunting knife. And the prosecution brings up that a sleepwalker wouldn't have the capacity to know that what he was doing was wrong, so there would be no need for him to feel like he needed to hide this evidence. So that to the prosecution is pure evidence that this was planned out and Scott was trying to cover his tracks and make up this ridiculous defense of sleepwalking. The defense does say that him trying to hide his clothes but not trying to hide the body or clean up anything else from the scene shows that there really was no logic at all to his actions, and that while maybe hiding his clothes is kind of a weird thing to do, it doesn't really prove anything because the whole situation is kind of a weird sequence of events. The prosecution was able to get one of the defense's sleep experts, though, to admit that even though he did believe that Scott was sleepwalking, he admitted that Scott changing his clothes 2 or 3 times was out of character for a sleepwalker, and that the way the stained clothes were hidden was also unusual for a sleepwalker. But that same expert said that he did believe Scott was sleepwalking. Just because it was unusual doesn't mean it was impossible. Of course, the prosecution brings in their own sleep expert as well, and his name is Dr. Mark Pressman. And he talks about the evidence, and he says, quote, "I think all the evidence says he was awake, and all the evidence says his behavior was far too complicated to be sleepwalking." End quote. He also goes on to say that there was 45 minutes between the beginning of this whole situation and the end, and he makes a list of 64 separate behaviors that Scott displayed over those 45 minutes. And he says that the only way a sleepwalker typically displays violence is when they're confronted. And so the fact that Scott stabbed his wife, so maybe he was confronted the first time, but then he leaves and then comes back to push her in the pool is a second act of violence that he wasn't provoked to do. So he's saying that right there proves that either one or two of both of those actions was planned. The defense also brings in 2 of Scott's cellmates, so the people he was staying with in prison, and they actually testify that they've seen Scott in what they think was actually sleepwalking. They say he would get up in the middle of the night, just walk towards the door of the cell and grab a hold of the cell bars, and he'd just shake them really hard, and they'd be talking to him, asking him what he's doing, and he just kind of be in a daze, wouldn't say anything, and just kind of stand there shaking the door of the cell. And he did that multiple times. And Scott's kids testify for the defense as well, and they stand up for him, saying that they don't believe that he did this on purpose, because they really didn't see any kind of violence in him ever growing up. Yeah, so like I said before, the prosecution seems to have everything that they would want except a motive. And an ABC 2020 episode also goes into a lot of detail about this case, and that episode is called While He Was Sleeping. And so they say that that Scott did have motive to kill his wife, and they kind of zero in on a note that a psychologist that was interviewing Scott while he was in jail had written down. So in this note, they zero in on this phrase, quote, unforgivable sin. And they really push this to try and say that Scott believed his wife had committed some horrible sin. And they kind of talk about, oh, maybe like Jarmila had cheated on Scott. But there was really no evidence at all that anything like that had happened. And Scott says that he himself, while he was talking to his psychologist, said that he did say unforgivable sin, but he was talking about himself, that he had committed an unforgivable sin. And so, I mean, if you, they're like totally spinning his words in this situation. Like, he can make anybody look guilty if you just isolate like one sentence or a couple of words without context. So I'm surprised that was even allowed in court and that nobody kind of expanded on that further. And that Forensic Files episode kind of went into more detail about the strain that might have been on their relationship or their marriage. So Scott, because they were Mormons, Scott really wanted to have more kids. They already had 2 kids, but Jarmila like kind of firmly said that she didn't want any more. They already had 2 teenagers, so she was kind of like done. And Jarmila had apparently shown resentment about how much time Scott had spent with his church activities. So he was really dedicated to the church, where Jarmila wasn't so much. And she was actually considering a divorce, apparently, according to Forensic Files. Yeah, so that's kind of the evidence back and forth for this, for Scott. What do you guys think so far? Like, what do you think is going to be the outcome of this case? Do you have any ideas?
I feel like it's so weird because, like, I feel like there's no way to really prove it on a from the defense's perspective. Like, I feel like, couldn't anyone just use the defense of like, oh, he was sleepwalking when it happened? Like, you could go commit a crime and say, oh, sleepwalking. Like, and you're not in the moment, like testing them and like checking to see, you know, those sleep experts, like, you know, those sleep tests they do. You're not doing that at the moment. So you don't actually know if it was a sleepwalking. Like, even if you have a history of sleepwalking, like, does that mean anyone with a history of sleepwalking can like use that as an excuse if they commit? I don't know. Like, it just seems really hard. And then even as you were talking, you said like, I don't know if it was just your wording, but you said like, the defense is speculating. I feel like if you go to trial, you can't just say our speculation is. You have to go in there and be like, no, this is what happened. So if even they're like just saying this is what we think might have happened, like, that's not strong enough, I feel. Yeah.
Well, I feel like they do that in a lot of cases, though. They're like, this is what the evidence is telling us. And I think every time either side is trying to say what happened, they're just making up a logical story because they don't actually know, right? So I feel like that was kind of that was just their story of what happened. But it was speculation because they didn't know. But it was like an educated guess.
Yeah, I'm kind of looking towards like he's not gonna be put in prison, or he's not gonna like be charged with that first-degree murder in the outcome. I feel like because he had those episodes when he was younger and people in evidence to prove that he does sleepwalk, I think they're gonna see it as just because he was sleepwalking. I don't think he's gonna like be held accountable for what he did. Yeah, that's my opinion.
Well, it could go either way, because, like, yeah, he does have a history of sleepwalking, but then, like AJ said, well, anyone that has a history of sleepwalking could just go kill someone and be like, oh, it was asleep, right? So, like, how do you can't prove that in that moment he was sleepwalking, even if he did it before.
And, like, the hiding of the clothes that they found in that, like, bag or whatever.
Yeah, like, he changed his clothes. Yeah, and I even feel like him, like, how the neighbor said he saw him turn on the lights and stuff. Like, if you were asleep, why would you turn those lights on and off? Unless it was just like a habit, right? Like, I mean, you can do things in your sleep because you know the layout of your house, right? You're like bonking into walls. So you can walk down the stairs, open the fridge, eat food. Maybe you just turn on a light. So that, I feel like that can be explained away and just like, that's your brain knowing what to do. But
and also I feel like because every person would be so unique. So I feel like no 2 sleepwalking cases are the same. So like when you were saying, when that expert who was saying like, yeah, it's unusual for this to have happened, but that doesn't mean that it wouldn't have happened, because, and like you said that expert still believed that he was innocent and he was sleepwalking. So like, yeah, I feel like it's really hard to say like, well, that's weird. You wouldn't normally do that if you're sleepwalking. But I mean, like, I feel like, you know, anything can happen. Like, it's a crazy situation to begin with. So, you know, just because you wouldn't expect that to happen doesn't mean that he didn't do it in that moment. I don't know.
Yeah. So it's like super interesting. So in that 2020 documentary that I mentioned earlier, they were able to interview some of the jury members, and the jury said at first the jury was split 8-4 in favor of the prosecution, and they talked a little bit more, discussed some more things, and then later the jury was split 10-2 for the prosecution, Ultimately, though, Scott was found guilty of first-degree murder. And one of the defense lawyers was interviewed, and he said that he just felt the jury wasn't educated or smart enough to interpret the scientific evidence that was presented. He said that they just couldn't understand the complexity involved in sleepwalking, or the sleepwalking field as a whole. So Scott was sentenced to life in prison without parole, and he was spared the death penalty. What do you guys think? Do you think he should have been guilty? Like, what were you leaning more towards?
I was just like, maybe not first degree murder, because I don't think he planned it. Like, first degree murder shocks me because I feel like maybe it would be like second degree, or maybe like manslaughter here. Like, I don't know, first degree just seems like a little bit harsh to me, because I don't think he didn't plan. I don't think he planned on murdering. I feel like he was sleepwalking and didn't know what he was doing. But
yeah, I feel like there were a couple of things that were kind of suspicious or whatever, but could maybe be explained away. I was leaning more towards that he was sleepwalking, but definitely not super strong in either way. So I feel like if I was on the jury, I would not. Like, how can you convict someone to life in prison if you have reasonable doubt? I mean, obviously they didn't, but I feel like I would in that situation. So it's not like enough. I wouldn't be confident enough to make me, sentence him to that. But I don't know.
Yeah, I feel like sleepwalking defense was super convincing, but it's really hard to say either way. And in the Forensic Files episode, the prosecutor did talk about how they thought that originally Scott was planning to make it look like a random person had come and killed his wife. That's why he hid his clothes, didn't clean up anything, and he was planning on just going back to bed and then waking up in the morning and being like, oh, someone killed my wife. But what ruined that was his neighbor actually seeing him putting him in the pool. And when Scott found that out, that's when something clicked in his head, and he was like, oh, I'm just gonna go with this. I don't know what happened. I don't remember anything defense. So that's kind of another story the prosecution was talking about as well.
That's very possible. I mean, it could have been the case, but like I said, I don't feel confident either way. So
I know, nobody actually really knows except Scott, and we know his side of the story, but we don't know if he's lying. So in the 2020 documentary, they interviewed Scott in January, and super recently. They interviewed Scott January of 2021. So they did a video call with him, and he's been excommunicated from the LDS Church. Once he was convicted, they kind of just shut him out. He also says that he still hasn't forgiven himself for killing Yarmela, and he said he probably never will. And he doesn't plan to ever get out of prison. Interestingly, Juan Martinez, who was that prosecutor, he was actually disbarred in 2020 after accusations of ethical misconduct and sexual harassment allegations. He denies all the allegations against him, but he did consent to being disbarred in 2020. So that's interesting.
Did you say that Scott said he won't get out of prison ever?
Yeah, Scott said he's not planning on ever getting out of prison. He just doesn't think it's ever going to happen.
He's not going to fight it?
I don't know. That's just what he said.
That's really weird to me. If you feel like you didn't do it, why would you want to stay there?
I don't think he wants to stay there. I think he just knows that there's no hope that he would ever be able to get out. There's just not enough for going for him.
Kind of sucks that his church just shunned him out like that.
That would be so shitty though. Say he was sleepwalking and he was totally innocent, or didn't know what he was doing. That would be so fucking shitty if just one night when you're just sleepwalking and then you commit this murder and you're in jail for the rest of your life because of something you had no control over. That sucks.
Yeah, I'd be interested to see if while he's in prison, if he's had any more obvious violent sleepwalking incidences, right? But I feel even if he has, like we said before, he couldn't prove that he actually was sleepwalking on that day. So
is he in jail cells with other people? Because I feel if they think that, I guess they don't think that he was sleepwalking, but I feel if anybody thought he was sleepwalking, I don't think it'd be a good idea to put him in a room with other people.
I don't know. They didn't go into any of that kind of detail. Okay, so I'm going to move on. This one it might be more well known. Everything that I look up, they always reference this case that I'm going to talk about now. This is actually a Canadian case, and the guy's name is Kenneth Parks. And this actually happened before Scott Falater's case. This one happened in 1987 in the Toronto area. Kenneth Parks was at the time, he was only 23 years old. And this case takes place May 24th of 1987. So the story goes that Ken fell asleep in front of his TV and he got up early in the morning sometime. Like, it was still dark out, so it was still pretty early. He grabbed his car keys. He went out the door. He left the front door wide open, got in his car, started it, drove out of his garage, and left the garage door completely wide open. Ken drove around 23 kilometers from Pickering, Ontario to Scarborough, Ontario, and he ended up at his in-laws' house. His in-laws were Barbara and Donald Woods. Ken grabs tire iron out of his car. He had keys to their house on his key ring, so he gets those keys, lets himself into the basement of their house, which is where Barbara and Donald slept. So he goes into the room and he strangles Donald, and then he goes to the kitchen, grabs a knife out of the kitchen, goes back to the bedroom, and he stabs his mother-in-law around 5 or 6 times, and then he beats her with the tire iron, and I believe he also beats Donald as well. Then he goes to the bedrooms of the couple's teenage daughters, and they wake up and they recall him, they recall hearing him outside, like, making really loud grunting noises outside their door. Like, they said it sounded like an animal. And then he stopped for a little bit, and then he continued to grunt again. So it's, like, super, like, terrifying if you were inside there listening to that. And then he doesn't actually get in their rooms, so that's a good thing. I don't know if he tried, but he just couldn't get in, or if he just never even tried to go in. But he eventually leaves the house. He gets back into his car, and he drives to the police station around 4:45 a.m. He goes in, and he's just like, I think I killed 2 people, but I can't remember. And he says he can see the face of Barbara Woods in his head, and she looks really sad, but he doesn't know why. So the police look at him, and they see that both of his hands actually had severed tendons, like where you flex your fingers. They were all severed from when the knife was slipping and had cut his hand while he was stabbing them, or stabbing Barbara. And they say that this is kind of, the defense uses this because sleepwalkers, they don't feel pain, they don't know they're hurt. And so this is a common thing with sleepwalkers, but it's also common for someone that's in shock to not know they're hurt, or they can't feel their pain. So Ken actually goes on trial for the murder of his mother-in-law. His father-in-law actually survived the attack. And Ken, just like Scott, had a history of sleepwalking. His mom, when he was younger, stopped him from jumping out of their 6-story window when he was a kid. And there was also, like, a long history of parasomnia in his family, and there was cases in his family of relatives that did sleepwalk, some that, like, sleep talked, and others that would sleep eat. So it definitely wasn't far-fetched to think that this was happening to Ken as well. So he also had those same factors that I had talked about before that trigger sleepwalking. He was sleep deprived for close to 48 hours before he had fallen asleep that night. He was undergoing, like, physical stress. He apparently had played a really intense game of rugby that day, and it was a really hot and humid day, and he was, like, super out of shape, so it would have, like, been physically stressful for him. And also, apparently, he was a gambler, and he had worked his way into a lot of debt, so that was another stressor in his life. According to the Toronto Globe and Mail, in the Chicago Tribune, prosecutors said that Ken defrauded his employer of over $30,000, put that money in his own bank account, and then gambled that away at the racetrack. So I guess that's super stressful, especially if he thinks he's going to get caught, or if he did get caught, that would weigh on you for sure. Evidence also came out at the trial that Ken had depleted all of his family savings, and he borrowed from a finance company to continue to feed that gambling habit. So, not a good situation, just definitely super stressful for him. And they said that Ken was actually planning a picnic the next day with his in-laws, and so they believe that maybe that's why when he got up out of bed, still asleep, that was what was in his head, that he was going over there for a picnic. So he was just doing that, and it's unbelievable that he was able to drive in his sleep all the way over there. Like, I can't get over that. And so all this evidence was presented at court, and Ken is actually acquitted in this case. And this actually made Canadian legal history because it was the first time a sleepwalking defense was actually successful in Canada. this case came up in the Scott Falater case. They said that maybe he had seen this, and that's why he wanted to use this as his defense, because it had worked for Ken. Anyway, the prosecution actually appealed the acquittal, but the acquittal was sustained, and Ken never went to jail for it. So that's super interesting as well. Yeah, and some experts were talking about this case. Dr. Carlos Shinek, who's a sleep clinician and psychiatrist who specializes in bizarre sleep patterns, and he says that he believes that the jury got it right, that all the signs were there for Ken to be a sleepwalker, and that he should have been acquitted, and they made the right choice. But also, I think it's interesting in Ken's case, like how experts are always like, don't wake up a sleepwalker, but in this case, like, no one interrupted him. He kind of just got up on his own, went to their house, and killed them, unless something interrupted him while he was there that they never talked about. But yeah, so that's kind of interesting in his case that he got off. What do you guys think about this one?
That's crazy. Like, the fact that he, like you said, he was able to get up and go all the way, drive himself all the way over there while you're asleep. Like, that's crazy. That's crazy to think. But I guess you do hear, like, there have been times where people say, like, sometimes you just go, it's not the same as sleepwalking, but you just get into autopilot mode. And, like, some people will drive home from work and then not even remember, like, the drive home, because they just, like, go into autopilot if they're so used to it. So obviously it's not the same thing, but it's just crazy to me that he was able to actually drive there without an accident in his sleep.
I remember talking about that in, like, I think the Cooper Harris case, where, like, people just are able to not remember their whole drive. And I think it was lucky that it was, like, so late at night that he was able to just, like, maybe there wasn't a lot of cars on the road, so he was able to kind of avoid getting into an accident. But I think it's crazy that he drove over 23 kilometers all the way over there, you know, incident free. Like, yeah, and then he got off. Crazy.
I mean, that's great that he got off, but I don't understand I don't see the difference in either of their cases. I mean, obviously one of them was more violent than the other, but I don't really see what the difference is. I mean, I see the difference,
maybe there wasn't, like, the sketchy, like, random, you know, hiding of clothes, bloody clothes and stuff. Like, maybe there was, like, not those glaring kind of suspicious things. Like, why would that happen if you're sleepwalking?
Yeah, and he...
Like, everything seems, like, consistent.
Yeah, and, like, Ken kind of turned himself in thinking, like, I did something, because he was covered in blood. So some people think that once he got in the car, he woke up, saw that he was covered in blood in his car, like, didn't remember what happened, so he panicked and went to the police. So maybe that makes him more credible because he turned himself in. I don't know. But I mean, both cases were still pretty violent. Like, Scott stabbed his wife 40 times and then, you know, dunked her in the pool. And then he stabbed and strangled and beat his mother-in-law. Ken did, so. Or his parents-in-law, so. I don't know. It's really scary that someone asleep can do those violent things. Like, that's what makes it so eerie. Not just the fact that they're up walking around like a zombie, but they'll actually kill you.
And the fact that you can get to that point, like the fact that you wouldn't wake up before you actually do it. Like, he's able to, like he's driving 23 kilometers without waking up. That's crazy.
That's what I was just gonna say. That, like, I don't, like, surprised he didn't wake up during the killings, because normally, like, if you're, like, get interrupted if somebody touches you or something like that, you think he would wake up. So I'm surprised he didn't wake up during that.
Yeah, I think when you cut your hands or something like that, the pain would wake you up, you think. Like, I don't know, like, I wake up from the simplest little thing. I'm pretty sure if I stabbed my own self in my sleep, I'd wake up. I think.
But I guess if you have a sleeping disorder, that's why it's a disorder.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, your brain's not working properly. I don't know. It's scary.
I do never want to come in contact with somebody who's sleepwalking.
I feel like
it creeps me out.
I feel like I almost have I feel like I have a sleep disorder. I feel like I almost have the opposite problems. Like, sometimes I have this thing like sleep paralysis, where, like, you wake up, like, your brain wakes up, but you still physically can't move because your body, like, you're still kind of sleeping. So, like, you're paralyzed because that's what's supposed to happen when you sleep, is your muscles are supposed to be paralyzed so you don't get up and walk.
That's so scary too.
So, like, sometimes you'll be laying there for, like, I don't know, it feels like forever, but it could be like 20 seconds where it's like you're awake but you can't move. It's like the creepiest, weirdest thing. It's creepy. I've had it happen, like, multiple times in my life.
Honestly, yeah, and people tell stories about that, and while they're like paralyzed in the dark in their bed, they always, something sketchy, they can always see something. Like, I remember I was talking to Lisa, who's our other sibling that doesn't do this podcast with us, and she says it happened to her more than once, and, like, she'd be paralyzed in her bed and, like, see, like, the sketchiest shit in her room. and like she couldn't wake up. Like, it's scary, and I'm just like, and apparently they say it happens to at least,
No,
and apparently it
go ahead.
happens to everybody at least once in their life. So it has never happened to me. It had to happen to you, Steph. So just wait, it's coming. I'm like terrified.
It's the
I think
creepiest
about it
thing.
every night.
I don't want that to happen to me. That's creepy as hell.
It is. It's weird. Like, I don't know. It'd be interesting to, like, I don't know if there's a correlation between, like, I don't know, like stress or whatever. Like, because it seems like there'd be like certain periods of time, like a month or two, where it happens very frequently, and then I'll go like a couple years without it happening, and then it happens again. Like, it's so weird. And I remember we were talking to, shout out to Uncle Randy, who's probably listening. But I remember he and I were. Yeah, because he and I were talking, like, he's like, oh yeah, the creepiest thing happens to me. And I was like, that happens to me too. Like, it's so weird. And it's so hard to describe. I mean, you guys can probably imagine how creepy it is, but like, until it actually happens to you, it's like even more creepy than just describing it.
Yeah, my partner, Alex, said it happened to him before too. And I'm just like fucking waiting for it to happen to me. It's terrifying.
I feel like maybe I vaguely remember where like one time where I could feel like I could see someone in my room or see something, but I don't know if that was just like me dreaming about it, because it scared me. The thought of it scares me so much that it was like a nightmare. So I don't know if that was actually real. But most of the time I feel like I just see like the ceiling or whatever. Or sometimes, because I'm like laying down, but sometimes I feel like I can see like as if I were sitting up. I can see straight ahead as if I was sitting up versus like just seeing the ceiling, like if I'm lying down. So it makes me think I'm almost like sitting up, right? But I'm not. I don't know. It's like an out-of-body experience. It's so weird. Yeah, I don't know. It's so fucking creepy.
I don't know what I find creepier, that or like a child coming into your room and sleepwalking and just staring at you, and you open your eyes and your child's just there.
I know, like, what are the creepiest things you can think of? Is like you waking up and there's like somebody like standing over you or something. Mm-hmm. Like, oh my god.
That's like what nightmares are made of.
I know. Or especially,
can we not talk about this anymore? Let's just not talk about this anymore.
I've woken up before, like my daughter's just like standing there. I'm like, what the hell? Like, why are you staring at me? Anyway, it's creepy. Yeah, so sleep is like super interesting and scary at the same time. So there's lots of other cases about like sleepwalking murders and stuff out there. So I'll definitely probably look up some more on my own, just because.
But I think like the
scares the shit out of me. So.
Yeah, but I think that like, not just one more thing about the sleep paralysis. I think that thing is kind of explained, like your like brain is like out of sync. Your sleeping brain is like out of sync with like your muscles, because obviously you're paralyzed when you're sleeping, right? But like it's like out of sync, so like your brain will wake up before your body wakes up. So that way, like, you can like be cognizant of like being awake, but you can't move.
Yeah, so that's in one of those articles that I was reading. It kind of went into how, like, when you're asleep and normally like your brain will send like the signals to your body not to move, so that blocks like that, you know, urge to move. But people that sleepwalk and get up and stuff, that like malfunctions for some reason, and just like, so those signals aren't there, so your body doesn't know not to get up and move. So that's like the disconnect between people that are like conked out, not moving, and people that get up when they're asleep. So
scary.
Yeah, it is. And I guess it would be the opposite with sleep paralysis. Like you said, those signals are like blocked, but they don't get unblocked, so your body can't move, even though your brain's awake.
Yeah, like you have trouble unblocking it, so you feel like you can't move. I mean, I guess the sleep paralysis, I mean, that's better than the alternative of getting up and fucking killing people in your sleep. So I'll take the paralysis over the sleepwalking.
I guess. And some people like hurt themselves, like they jump out of windows, or you know what I mean, like jump through the screen door or something and hurt themselves while they're sleepwalking. So like I said, is I guess a little bit worse than sleep paralysis. So that's today's cases. I hope you guys enjoyed them. I really enjoyed researching them, and hope to see you next time. You can follow us on Instagram at Crime Family Podcast, or Twitter at Crime Family Pod 1. We also have a Facebook page called Crime Family, and we have a Gmail account, crimefamilypodcast@gmail.com. So let us know what you think.
And make sure to check out the Destination Mystery podcast that we mentioned at the beginning, because it's super cool. And if you like true crime and are into our podcast, then you'll also be into their podcast. So just wanted to say that.
Definitely check it out. All right. Yeah, so we're almost at the end of the season, actually. Our next episode is going to be our season finale episodes. It's a two-parter. Both will be released next week. Hope you guys enjoy it. And
we have a special guest for it.
Oh, yeah, we'll have a special guest. So we'll talk about that when the time comes. And yeah, see you then. And then we hope to see you season 2. Bye.
Peace out.
Bye.